H.G. Wells writes some of his most famous books over the span of only 5 years, between 1896 and 1901. This includes his most well known novel, The Time Machine, as well as The Island of Dr. Moreau, First Men in the Moon, and the book that we're going to discuss today, which is The War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds is a very important text in the history of science fiction because it is the first ever alien invasion story. We are now extremely familiar with this genre, in fact, saturated with narratives of alien invasion. But whatever you imagine now, whether you think of Independence Day or Mars attacks or any number of more or less well-known and more or less sophisticated alien invasion fantasies, they all have their origin in this one text, in The War of the Worlds. And it's interesting to have a closer look at the historical context of this book and to understand how Wells himself actually comes up with this idea of alien invasion, of Martians attacking all of humanity. And what's interesting is that Wells himself goes back to an even earlier literary tradition, a tradition which is now largely no longer familiar to us, which is called future war narrative. Future war novels were very popular in the final decades of the 19th century, and we now know about this genre essentially thanks to the work of the cultural historian and science fiction critic I.F. Clarke, who's published this text called Voices Prophesying War. Future war narratives also have a foundational literary text, and it's a book which is called The Battle of Dorking by somebody whose name is George Tompkins Chesney, first published in 1871. Chesney was a retired military man, and he was a nationalist, a conservative, and he was extremely worried about what he perceived as an irresponsible lack of attention to the state of the British Army. He noticed and was pleased to see that Britain had an extremely powerful navy, but he worried that without this defense, Britain would become increasingly vulnerable on other fronts. 1871 is, of course, an important and meaningful date in this context because it is the date of the Franco-Prussian War. Franco-Prussian War, which, as many of you will know, was won by the Prussians under the strategic leadership of Otto von Bismarck, and was won over an unusually short span of time thanks to a very intelligent use of new technology and particularly new forms of transportation. Above all, the Prussians used trains to transport their troops right into the French mainland. And France wasn't prepared for this at a military level, and the war ended infamously, if you wish, with the German Empire being proclaimed in the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. Chesney, a British nationalist, was extremely worried that this technological progress in warfare could eventually damage the military might of Britain, and he writes this novel, which is a sort of novel with a future setting, a near future setting. He writes it as a warning to his contemporaries. Imagine what would happen if the British Navy was called to the Americas because of some unrest there, and if at the same time the Germans invaded across the Channel and managed to occupy much of the British territory. This is essentially what the novel is about. It describes the battles that take place, and it describes some heroic resistance among those British who refuse to accept the German victory. It's not an interesting book by any means. It's not a book that has a great literary value. It's however a text that was extremely popular in those years, and that found numerous admirers and even emulators, not just in Britain, but in other countries as well. So writers working in different languages wrote their own versions of this. Germans imagined French invasions, French writers imagining German invasions, Eastern Central Europeans imagining Russian or indeed German invasions, and everybody imagining, if they felt particularly inclined to kind of sort of global catastrophe, Chinese invasions. So you have a flurry of essentially very, very similar texts with a kind of sort of repetitive plot structure, boosting this sense of nationalistic pride and this idea of the hostile stranger as a threat to national sovereignty and integrity. H.G. Wells was, of course, extremely uncomfortable with these narratives and extremely critical of their understanding of sovereignty. He was a socialist. He was a member of the Fabians, which is one of the founding organizations of the British Labour Party, and he was a pacifist, and he believed in world government. In some of his later writings, he proclaimed that he saw world government as the only hope for survival of the species. So what Wells does in The War of the Worlds is he inverts the structure of these earlier texts in one important respect. Instead of giving us a hostile stranger, and he gives us this mysterious, unimaginable enemy, the Martians. Martians attacking with these big tripods, with these big robotic machines, and having an extraordinarily superior technology, and destroying humans in the Thames Valley and across London as if they were pests, and Martians essentially being just sort of brain-like, large, almost limbless creatures who manage to sort of move and interact thanks to these tripods. So it's a powerful, it's a successful new vision of hostile invasion, but it doesn't serve to reassure readers in their sense of identity and otherness, but rather undermines these certainties in very subtle and unexpected ways. So first of all, by giving us an imaginary external enemy, Wells, of course, has the possibility of celebrating the importance of humanity as a single species, not as a nation. But secondly, the Martians, these uncanny strangers in the novel, are in fact not something that in allegorical terms represents any particular existing community. You can read the novel, and if you read it, you're compelled to read and interpret it in different ways, and as you read, you sort of oscillate. There's moments when you definitely identify with the human characters, but there's also moments when Wells specifically invites us in a very eerie and seemingly detached way to identify with the Martians. And the first of these moments occurs only 1.5 pages into the novel. It's a famous passage in which Wells explicitly compares the motivations and the political project of the Martians to that of British imperialism. And I'm just going to read a few sentences from this to give you a better idea of how he achieves this. So he writes about the Martians. Before we judge them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? You see, this is a disturbing passage, not least because Wells uses the terminology and appeals to an idea of racialized identity that is very troubling and problematic from our current perception. So when he talks about superior and inferior human races, on some level he makes the point as a socialist that these differences should be overcome. But on a different level, this is, of course, in order to sort of even articulate these differences, he does, of course, use very much the language of diversity that seemingly he deplores. Similarly, the example that he provides of the Tasmanians, the Australian Aboriginals who were victims of colonial settlement in largely by the British in Australia, and who were throughout much of the 20th century were believed to have become extinct as a result. In fact, there are now Tasmanian communities, and we know that this was the sort of simplification of history. But for Wells, this was very much a token gesture to a particular moment in settler colonialism, which he describes in terms that would have been shocking to his contemporaries as war of extermination. So I encourage you to think about this, these different levels of reading as you engage with the War of the Worlds, and to think about the legacy of this text in popular culture, literature and film through the works of important authors such as Orson Welles or Steven Spielberg, who provided adaptations, but also to think of the assumptions that H.G. Wells makes in his own historical and cultural context, and how much of this appears problematic to us.